Catholic History Trek, a podcast exploring the Catholic past.
I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercy of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, pleasing unto God, your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be reformed in the newness of your mind, that you may prove what is the good and the acceptable and the perfect will of God. These words are found in the onset of the 12th chapter of St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, and they echo the sentiments found in the Gospel of Luke, which exhorts the reader, "For whoever will save his life shall lose it. For he that shall lose his life for my sake shall save it. For what is a man advantaged if he gain the whole world and lose himself and cast away himself?" With these biblical passages in mind, it's reasonable to ponder, to what extremes would one go to separate from the world in order to deepen their union with God? Through the ages, this question has been answered by different people in a myriad of different ways, by those who were genuinely seeking to die to self and unite themselves to the will of God. And perhaps the most extreme examples of those seeking to deprive themselves of the world in order to achieve a more intimate devotion to God are the Anchorites and the Stylites. I'm Scott Schulze, and in this episode of Catholic History Trek, I'll be trekking solo, without my adept co-host Kevin Schmeezing, through the history of these Anchorites and Stylites. Since the earliest days of Christianity, men have sought to triumph over the two unavoidable enemies of human salvation, the flesh and the devil, by depriving themselves of the assistance of their ally, the world. The natural impulse of earnest souls seeking this victory was to withdraw either temporarily or forever from the world, as sanctioned by the scriptural examples such as John the Baptist spending his many years in the desert, and Jesus himself, who spent 40 days in the desert before beginning his public ministry. A host of holy men and women have sought to imitate these examples, to free themselves from distracting cares and allow the soul to be occupied with divine thoughts. The earliest of these fugitives from human society took to the deserts of Egypt and Syria, where caves and tombs became homes for a number of Christian ascetics. But no matter how deeply the would-be hermit buried himself into the wilderness, it seems he was always within easy reach when charity called upon him, whether it was kindred spirits seeking out the holy man and building cells around his, or pleading for his experience in providing a rule and spiritual guidance for those seeking to imitate his example, as we saw with St. Benedict in our podcast regarding the history of the St. Benedict medal. And thus, the hermit's solitary life could easily develop into the cenobitic life of a monastery, and even if the holy soul were to seek refuge from the monastery and plunge himself deeper into the desert, as we'll see in a future episode on St. Anthony of the Desert, this was no guarantee of providing the desired solitude, and even if one could avoid the invasion of admirers and imitators, they could still be called upon to return from this retirement and serve the Church. To this end, some holy men and women would undertake extreme measures to ensure they could achieve the desired isolation. And perhaps the two most extreme examples of this are the Anchorites and the Stylites. The first of these is the Anchorite, coming from the Greek word for "I withdraw," which was prefigured in early monastic movements of isolation in the 6th and 7th centuries, but in its recognizable form, emerged as a popular practice of religious isolation in the Middle Ages, in which one died to self by literally entering a tomb, as it were. The anchorite would enter a small enclosure known as a reclusory via an elaborate ceremony taken from the office of the dead, during which the last rites were administered, and upon the conclusion of the ceremony, the entry to the reclusory would be walled up, and the anchorite was effectively sealed up in a little cell or tomb. It's said that an anchorite who left their enclosure after undergoing the ceremony could not only be forcibly returned by the authorities, but could even be guilty of sin and face damnation. In England, the earliest examples are recorded from the 11th century, with the height of popularity taking place from the 13th through 15th centuries, with about 200 known anchorites during that time. By the 16th century, the number of anchorites plummeted considerably, as they were among the religious forcibly removed during the dissolution of the monasteries, when the English crown confiscated the property of the Catholic Church. The anchoritic life attracted many men and women throughout the Middle Ages. The men were mostly secular priests, while the women, who outnumbered the men, were mostly from the laity. It was rare for a member of a religious community to enter the enclosure of a reclusory. One of the most well-known anchorites is the English mystic Blessed Juliana or Julian of Norwich, who in 1373 was the beneficiary of a miraculous healing when on her deathbed and received the mystical revelations which she recorded in her work, Revelations of Divine Love. Even though the goal was solitude, one could not live an anchoritic life in a reclusory without assistance. A servant was needed to bring food to the anchorite, as well as remove waste, and could assist by attending to visitors seeking to visit the anchorite. Before the authorities would sanction enclosure of an anchorite, the would-be recluse had to be able to support for their material needs, either because they came from a wealthy family and were of independent means, or because they were the recipient of alms and grants, from kings down to peasants, who offered support in exchange for the anchorite's prayers. The basic reclusory, where the anchorite lived, would often be built adjoining a parish church, and would be called an anchor hold. The reclusory would consist of the cell where the anchorite lived, and at least one window facing towards the altar within the church, and a second window facing outward to the world. And while this was the basic structure of reclusory, the design would vary. Some had as many as 3 rooms, including small quarters for a servant and a parlor for visitors. The anchorite's cell would have a window facing both quarters and the parlor. Or, if there was no parlor present, the window would just face the outside world, and sometimes a reclusory would even have a garden attached to it. The life of an anchorite was a life of self-imposed isolation, and various manuals were written for the benefit of the anchorite to aid them in achieving their goal of spiritual union with God, and to avoid the pitfalls of distraction and to keep from going crazy. Some advice included having a trusted friend scrupulously guard the anchorite's window, refusing access to visitors who came just to exchange gossip, guarding the cell window in senses from temptation and distractions, from prayer and meditation, establishing routines of prayer and spiritual reading at fixed times of the day, utilizing mentally absorbing hobbies to keep occupied, such as sewing clothes for the poor or vestments for the church, and to sit alone in silence, listening and speaking to Christ, limiting communications to physical needs and spiritual well-being, and even then, only briefly. A couple of these manuals for anchorites include the Anchorina Visa, which was Rule for Anchoresses, and Aura de Revus, de Institutis Inclusarum, Rules for a Solitary. The Rules for an Anchoress is an anonymous 13th century guide broken into 8 parts, which includes advice such as warning not to look for comfort, to keep occupied to shield the mind from temptation, to avoid sensory delights which lead to disturbance, and even suggests keeping a cat. It also provides rules for proper conduct of the anchoress, such as not spending too much time near the window, and no eating meat or wearing of clothing accessories that were merely decorative and not practical. The other manual was written by Aura de Revus, who was an abbot of the Cistercian monastery of Revus in the 12th century. He composed his Rules for a Solitary around the year 1160, drawing from the Rule of St. Benedict and adapting it to the life of a recluse, with its monastic hours of prayer and readings and minimalistic food intake. He addressed it to his older sister, who had become a recluse and requested a rule of life. While Aurid's sister had walled herself up on her own property, as opposed to the later practice of being attached to a church, the principles he outlined in his rule transcend to anchoritic life. The Rule for a Solitary is defined by 3 sections. The first section contains rules for bodily observances, by which the recluse may govern the behavior of the outward person. The second section includes directions for cleansing the inner person from vices and adorning her with virtues. And the third section contains meditations to stir up the love of God, feed it, and keep it burning. A few interesting lines from Aurid's rule include: he advises the recluse to have 2 servants, an older one with an established reputation for virtue to run the household and screen visitors, and a younger one to perform errands. He decries the typical recluse, who perches at her window to soak up the scandal of the neighborhood gossip, a practice which, he warns, soon invites demons into her quarters. Arid also warns that male visitors to the female recluse should be received infrequently, and only in the presence of a third person, because, as he points out, some recluses are so lax that as long as they are not drawn forth from their cell pregnant, or as long as no infant betray its birth by wailing, they consider themselves to be living well. And finally, as a warning for his sister, he implores her to the timeless advice, "I would have you never rest secure, but always be afraid of failing, of succumbing to those things which provide material for vice, eating, sleeping, bodily relaxation, familiarity with women and effeminate men, and sharing their company." At the beginning of this episode, I mentioned two sets of hermits who went to extremes to pursue an ascetical life of seclusion. The first ones were the Anchorites. The next group are the Stylites. Unlike the Anchorites, who enclosed themselves in a cell, the Stylites took to living atop a pillar, or stylos. As mentioned in our previous podcast on fasting, the practice of fasting dates back to the beginnings of the church, as Christians fasted every Wednesday, every Friday, and during Lent, consuming only one small daily meal after sundown. By the later part of the 4th century, some Christians had begun taking the duration and severity of this fasting and other forms of self-mortification to extremes. A few examples of these self-mortifications include examples from Plotinus, who wrote in his Historica Luciaca in the late 4th or 5th century, which was a history on the monks of Egypt. In it, Plotinus tells of a hermit in Palestine who dwelt in a cave on the top of a mountain and who for the space of 25 years never turned his face to the west. St. Gregory of Nazianzus spoke of a solitary who stood upright for many years, absorbed in contemplation, without ever lying down. And Theodoret claims to have seen a hermit who passed 10 years in a tub, suspended in midair by poles. From this ascetical spirit which permeated Eastern Christianity, there emerged St. Simon, or Simeon, the Stylite, who is perhaps the first and most famous of the Stylites. Simeon the Stylite, also called Simeon the Elder, was born around 388 in northern Syria and lived as a shepherd, before entering a monastery at the age of 16. His practices of austerity were so extreme that he was deemed unfit for life in the community. After leaving the monastery, he became a recluse, while adopting the practice of eating or drinking nothing during the entirety of Lent, and continually standing upright as long as his limbs could sustain him. After 3 years living as a recluse in a hut, he ventured to a small rocky cave in the desert, but his solitude was invaded by many pilgrims seeking his counsel and prayers. So, Simeon had a pillar erected with a small platform positioned atop, from which he made his home until he died some 36 years later. Over those final years, the original 9-foot-tall pillar was replaced by a series of taller pillars until his final one stood 50 feet above the ground. He addressed crowds who gathered below him, and through the use of a ladder, visitors could ascend the pillar to visit him, or carry away the many letters he wrote, of which some still exist today. His fame as an ascetic spread through Europe, and he was revered by the Emperor Theodosius and the Empress Eudocia. Simeon remained exposed to the elements, never permitting a shelter to be built atop the pillar, and only allowed for a stake to be mounted atop the pillar so he could secure himself to it in order to remain upright through all of Lent. Although in later years, he continued this Lenten practice, but without the aid of the support. Upon the saint's death in the year 459, the practice of living atop a pillar did not die with him, but a number of imitators carried on the ascetical practice in the East. Some of the more well-known examples include St. Daniel Stylites, who was a disciple of Simeon and continued the discipline of living atop a pillar, and was also renowned for holiness, and was also visited by emperors Leo and Zeno. About a century after St. Simeon the Elder were Simeon the Younger and St. Alypius. Another saint, Luke the Younger, was a 10th century Stylite, In addition to these few examples, there were many other stylites and even some women who undertook the endeavor. Some of these later stylites erected shelters atop the columns. Attempts were made to introduce stylite asceticism to the West, but never took off, although in the East, the practice lasted into the 15th century in the Ruthenian Catholic Church, which is a group of Catholics originating around Ukraine who celebrate the Ruthenian rite of the liturgy. St. Simeon's pillar still exists within the ruins of St. Simeon's Stylite Church in Syria, although weather, war, and artifact hunters have reduced it from its once magnificent height to only a few feet tall. The self-isolation undertaken by Anchorites and Stylites, which were once practiced among Christians seeking to die to the world and seeking complete union with God in this life in preparation for the next, seem to have both faded into history about 500 years ago. But you never know. Perhaps my co-host Kevin Schmeezing is currently building a 50-foot tall pillar in his backyard from which to live. If he is, hopefully he can get it wired to record future podcast episodes. In all seriousness, when Anchorites and Stylites were seeking their lives of solitude and prayer, the language of the church would have been Latin. So, in honor of these holy men and women, we'll end our episode as we always do, with a prayer in the church's historic language of Latin. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen.
Thank you for listening to Catholic History Trek. You can reach us at catholichistorytrek@gmail.com.